Thank you, Rachel, for the introduction. I'm here together with Juliette. And yesterday, we were discussing about doing more research on people living with ALS. And today, I want to give you some closer insight how to include people and follow up people with dysarthria and frontotemporal dementia. And first, I want to talk with you about patient retention. So how do you make sure that if you include someone into your clinical trial, that that person is also remaining into the clinical trial? And therefore, it's important to develop a strategy on forehand before you start the clinical trial, how to make sure that the person living with ALS can also complete the clinical trial that he or she is in. And of course, with this disease, it can happen that there is disease progression, and therefore someone with the disease cannot come to your clinic anymore. And Juliette will give some insights on thoughts that or preparation that you can do to avoid or at least to get rid of some barriers for people living with ALS to get them into your clinic. And why is it important to think about patient retention? Actually, that starts already when you inform someone that wants to participate into your clinical trial during the reach out of the patient information leaflet, but also during the informed consent procedure, that the person living with ALS understands that the clinical trial that they want to participate in is not a treatment, but that you work together or collaborate together to find if that clinical trial that the patient is participating in might be a potential future treatment and not necessarily for that person themselves. But we do understand, and that's also what I'm explaining when I do the informed consent process with the person, that if I was at the other side on the table, I also would like to have some benefits from it myself. However, I cannot promise that if the person starts to enroll into the clinical trial. And some of the clinical trials do have like an open label extension. And even with the open label extension, we still cannot promise that the person living with ALS included into the clinical trial is actually benefited from that medicine. We do know that the person receives the actual medicine, but we still do not know whether it's effective, because that's why we do the clinical trial. Also, it's important to think about logistical aspects. I'm from quite a small country. People living in our country feel like 2 hours driving is already quite far. I know a lot of people here are from Australia, the US. I think they will call it around the corner. But it is important to have some sense about that, how people, about people's expectation, like is 1 hour far, is 2 hours far. Also, when you schedule the appointments, will you book them in at 8 a.m.? Or if people feel like they still need to travel quite some, that you will schedule the appointments, for example, at 11 if the clinical trial allows that. And also supportive services. There are a lot of opportunities, which Juliette will show some light on, that can get rid of the barriers for people coming to your clinic. And that brings us to the preventive measures.
Great. Perfect. And I think Tommy touched on this already, but when we talk about the topic of patient retention, I think we have a tendency, especially in our investigators meeting, to really focus on the end of the trial, or once patients have been in the trial for many weeks or months already. The way we see it is that this really needs to be prepared much in advance. So first time you meet the patient in clinic or in another setting, that's where those first stones to guarantee patient retention are actually set. And so this is leading to all of the nitty-gritty of the clinical trials, because when you touch on patient retention, you really have to make sure patients will understand that they will have to come, and it's just not, you'll have to come quite often. No, you'll have to come once a week, once every 2 weeks. How do you handle all of the logistical aspects around this? And we have decided to take this talk with the spectrum of FTD and dysarthria. And this has a huge impact, and this should be discussed with patients when you meet them and you discuss about patient retention in a clinical trial. We know that around 50% of patients either present with or will develop cognitive symptoms, and this needs to be a discussion with the patients and the family members. If those symptoms arise in your disease progression, how do you think this will impact your trial participation? Are you willing to still go through this even though you will anticipate symptoms you don't even know yet? So those conversations are usually quite tough to have, especially when no symptoms are present, FTD or dysarthria symptoms. However, we encourage, when that is possible, to have those as a conversation, as a team conversation and support. When it comes to the nitty-gritty of the details, I think for patient retention that we really need to be honest and clear about potential adverse events, and this should be clearly stated to patients. So some adverse events are very common and they're expected, and some not so much, and those should be described. And for example, such as, if you fall, do you think this will impact your trial participation? Most likely, yes. If you have any sort of adverse events, what do you think you could implement in your daily life that will maintain your trial participation? And then you have to weigh in. Is it a balance within the quality of life of your patient? Is it just for the trial? And where do you put the stop? And I think you've touched on quite a lot of the other points, so we can jump onto the FTD part of the patient retention.
So, sorry for
No.
getting all the info on your slides. Okay.
That's it.
So as I think many of you, or not all of you, are familiar with this picture, that ALS FTD is on a spectrum, so it is not only frontotemporal dementia or only ALS, but it could be a combination of symptoms. And especially if you are including people into clinical trials, like frontotemporal dementia might not be like upfront. So I'm wondering, like, I think the majority of you are all working in diagnostic clinics. Who of you do like a cognitive assessment at diagnosis? So if you can put up fingers, so ECAS, ALS, CBS.
MMSE, MOCA.
Yeah. I see one. Okay. Two. I think, yeah. So I think the majority does do some sort of cognitive testing during the ALS clinic, but it's important to know, like, what is the outcome? And because if there is some sort of cognitive deficit or like some symptoms of frontotemporal dementia, that will eventually progress during the clinical trial. And it is important to, or even more important, to plan for that, to make a strategy for that, even more than the logistical aspects. And we put out some figures here. It's like 15% of people with ALS have like full-blown symptoms of frontotemporal dementia, but there's a way broader spectrum out there. So as Juliette mentioned, up to 50% do have some sort of frontotemporal dementia symptoms, which can influence like not coming to your clinic for follow-ups, not taking the medication that you're wanting to test, not describing the adverse events, which is not only influencing the patient safety, but also other trial participants. And clinical trial protocols do not really give us the solid criteria. They leave it up to the investigator's opinion. There's like an MMSE below 20, but not often is an ECAS, for example, performed, or a full neuropsychological assessment. And it is like phrased as like significant cognitive impairment. I think clinical trial protocols can do way better than that, than significant cognitive impairment. I mean,
It doesn't mean
Yeah,
anything.
it gives flexibility, but it also makes it difficult. I mean, we do not want to exclude a patient because they have some symptoms of frontotemporal dementia, and I think, especially if they are not severely impacted at that very moment yet, but we know what will come, and that will influence, or that might influence clinical trial participation. So I think, therefore, people who are writing these clinical trial protocols might not only say significant cognitive impairments up front, but how will that impact the clinical trial participation if they are 1 year in the trial. And then during the trial, what are the stopping rules? So one of these stopping rules is like non-compliance for whatever reason. That's not even cognitive. It could be because the patient does feel like lack of efficacy, and they meet certain criteria that they cannot participate in the trial anymore, or any situation that the investigator feels that the patient could not participate anymore. But these are hard conversations to remove someone from the trial and say, "Oh, sorry, you were good at the inclusion criteria, but now we feel you're not compliant anymore." That's not something we want to deliver. So that message we do not want to deliver to our patients, because people do not understand. Like, it's difficult to understand. Also, the caregivers that comes with the patient is difficult to explain to our people. So therefore, it would be somehow it would be nice to get some more solid stopping rules, or like a plan what to do if your patient develops frontotemporal dementia that impacts the participation into the trial. And then we show a light on dysarthria.
So when it comes to patient retention and dysarthria, because dysarthria is quite often present as soon as we meet patient for the first time in clinic, it comes when, in relationship to trial participation and trial retention, as I see it as a notion of equity in access. So this is something I work on quite intensively in my PhD work, how equitable trials are for patients depending on what symptoms they present with. And when it comes to dysarthria, it does not only touch on patient retention into a clinical trial, but also patient inclusion. So for patient inclusion, we often talk about, well, the patient is not able to blow in the tube for VC, for example, so then can you use a mask? When teams are young teams or teams with new staff and they don't know those little tricks at the beginning, it really needs to be taught to them, because this can lead to bulbar patients, for example, not being considered in the same way. And this is something we see a lot. So bulbar patients are underrepresented in the trial population just because they're not considered in the same way when it comes to their dysarthria symptoms. And when it comes to patient retention, as the disease progresses and dysarthria worsen or appears for some patients, then there's a lot of alternatives that are there. We can do remote assessments by the phone. More and more outcomes and assessments are now validated over the phone. And then it comes to also patient burden to, I think, increase patient retention. How can you make it easier for your dysarthria, but also FTD patients, to stay into the trials? And this should not come from the patient. This should come from us, the community, of using those spaces like the APF, of talking with the SLP, who will talk to the neuropsychologist, who will say, oh, wait, I can actually think of a system for your dysarthric FTD patient to stay in the trial longer. However, that being said, I think we should always balance it out with the quality of life. At some point, where does it stop making sense for the patients to come? And then it's also a topic to have with pharmaceutical companies, that when this line is being crossed, well, patient dropouts will exist. So all of those points need to be considered, and I think this really should be considered under the larger umbrella of equity, as I was saying earlier, both in access and in retention participation. And we'll wrap up, because Rachel is coming on the stage, with a few points for food for thoughts. And I think we wanted to ask you, by a show of hands, those 4 main points of, if you could raise your hand if you're familiar with people having FTD and or cognitive impairment symptoms, let's say, and being in a trial right now? Yeah. Okay, so minority. And maybe we'll skip the ones where they are more interactive because we're running on time. Do you think, maybe you can raise your hand, if you think there should be a very clear set of guidelines for stopping rules in trial design when it comes to FTD symptoms and dysarthria? Maybe raise your hand if you think yes.
Maybe we should say, don't raise your hand if you're not agreeing.
So you see how he's changing the results. So everybody agrees. Well, we're going to leave you on those points, but I hope this gave you a clearer picture on how patient retention actually starts way earlier than when the patients are in the trial. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I did not close it.
Thank you, Juliette. And Tommy, that's a really interesting topic, and it's a real challenge, isn't it, keeping people in, particularly with MND, in trials. I think Richard has a couple of questions for you.
Yeah, there are two comments that have come online, and I'm going to put them both together. So Lynn Brahmeyer from ALS Problem Solvers says, if cognitive issues are progressing, understanding is decreasing. Is that right? And Kevin Robinson from Neil says that regarding preventative measures, he recommends participants should have the chance to review the informed consent in their home well before the screening visit.
Do you want me to take the first one? Yeah. So I'll address the first comment. So it's a beautiful question because that's what we all think when we start hearing about cognition. We hear cognition and you think understanding. And it's much more complex than that. And we're going to rephrase the situation and we're going to say it's much more complex and we're going to use this complexity for our own advantage. When you are cognitively impaired, it doesn't mean you understand less. It can mean many things. Maybe your executive function is impaired. So it's harder for you to plan. It's harder for you to, let's say, go grocery shopping without a list and you want to make a roast. What do I need? Oh, if I don't have my list, I can't make that. It doesn't mean you don't understand your recipe of how to make a roast. It just means it's harder for you to plan it. So now let's use this and let's say, well, if we have tools, I'm thinking of ECAS, but there are other tools, that allow you to have a very clear profile of the cognition of your patient, then you know the areas of cognition where your patient is more challenged. And then you can better support your patient to go through life, clinic, trial participation. So some patients, yes, will have a difficulty of assimilating notions and making links between them, and so we would call them understanding. But this can be, we can navigate around that, and maybe other areas of cognition are impacted, and we can navigate around that too. So everything is manageable. Yeah.
Yeah, with regards to the information patient leaflet, the GCP guidelines said like patients need sufficient time to think about like whether they want to participate. So that already gives some guidance on, yes, people need to not get the patient information leaflet this 5 minutes before they come into screening. So definitely people need, we roughly provide them a week, but if we feel it's not sufficient, then we will extend that time if the screening period will allow. And we also ask them to talk with their multidisciplinary team or their general practitioner to talk it through what it means to participate into clinical trials. So that's definitely part of retention as well, rather than having patients coming in, sign, and then not knowing what they're signed up for.
And to this, I will just add that I love to recommend discussing your consent form with your family and friends because they will come up with questions you did not even think of. So gather all of those questions in a list, come back to your study team with all of those questions, and you'll go through all of them and you will get answers.
So thank you, Juliette. And Tommy, I think you show kind of care and compassion to all your participants in the studies, so thank you so much.